Take a look inside, connect your heart, your mind, yeah. The pain you feel won't hide. You're not alone, we'll rise together, right? Can we here to fight this misery? Sitting with the heart, we set it free. Show a better for community. Say you wanna write this world with me.
Good evening, and welcome to the fourth installment of An Untold Past. I'm Michael Trong, and I'm the Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum, located in Los Angeles, California. We have been solidifying a partnership with the Chinese Canadian Museum of British Columbia for over 7 months to bring you this collaborative program focused on the Chinese diaspora in Canada. And we're excited to finally present this program tonight. Before we begin, the Chinese American Museum acknowledges that this virtual event is taking place across the continent of North America, also known as Turtle Island, original and unceded territory of hundreds of sovereign indigenous people and nations. We acknowledge and honor the original caretakers of the various places our speakers are from joining us from. Today, I'm joining you from downtown Los Angeles, physically located on the historic village of the Yangna in the Tovangna unceded territories of the Gabalina Shoshone, Keats, and Tongva indigenous people of these lands. To this day, there are at least 7 tribes of the Gabalino people who maintain an ongoing presence, power, and relations among their people, their natural relations, and the land they belong to. I invite you to remember the indigenous people who affirm their sovereignty and ongoing relations with the land you currently occupy, and ask yourself, how do you, your people, or your organization honor these relatives? I would now like to also take this moment to thank our FCAM board members and staff, as well as a special thank you to all of our community partners from the US and Canada for supporting this program. Here are some things that you might need to know before we begin. The program is being recorded and we made public for viewing on our YouTube channel in the future. Your video and microphone has been disabled, so if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to send a chat to Chinese American Museum, and we try to address them towards the end of the program. We're excited to be here tonight with our new friends at the Chinese Canadian Museum as we share this collaborative program with all of you. Our museum tells the stories of the Chinese diaspora throughout North America, and these partnerships allows us to explore the depth and rich history of our community. We'd like to congratulate them on the recent opening of the new museum, and we're happy to begin this partnership with our new friends. Now, I'd like to welcome Sarah Ling, the Exhibitions and Programs Manager at the Chinese Canadian Museum of British Columbia. Hi, Sarah, and welcome.
Hi, Michael. Wonderful to be hosting this evening with you. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. On behalf of the Chinese Canadian Museum of British Columbia here in Vancouver, Canada, we're also thrilled to be collaborating with the Chinese American Museum for this program this evening as part of an Untold History series. We are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the territories where I am tuning in from. Our work is based on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we thank them for their ongoing hospitality. And through our work at the Chinese Canadian Museum, we really do encourage all of you to also reflect on the lands that you are on, and also on the interconnectedness between your communities and Indigenous peoples. As Michael mentioned, we are a fairly new organization. We are really excited to be establishing the first public museum of its kind in Canada, dedicated to Chinese Canadian history, contributions, and living heritage. And Michael, you mentioned that we have opened, not quite yet. We are anticipating our opening next year in our permanent home at the Wing Sang building in Vancouver, Chinatown. But we have been really fortunate to operate a temporary exhibition over the past 2 years and get to know the community that way. I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for this evening, Dr. Dorothy Fujita-Rony, and I'll just provide a short introduction before passing the mic to Dorothy. So Dorothy is a professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She is the author of American Workers, Colonial Power, as well as The Memory Keepers, Gendered Knowledges, Empires, and the Memory, and Indonesian American History. Dorothy has worked with different public history organizations since the late 1980s, including the Museum of Chinese in the Americas, the Filipino American National History Society, and the Southeast Asian Archive at the University of California. She earned her undergrad and graduate degrees from the Department of American Studies at Yale University. Presently, Dorothy is beginning a book project on Southeast Asian American archives and knowledge production, and is building a new collaborative oral history project on Filipino Americans in Orange County, California. So Dorothy, it's a pleasure to have you this evening, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much. I am really honored to be here, and it's always interesting because now we are remote and on Zoom, and I'm trying to figure out how to do my camera. But at the same time, it is such a precious moment. Even in this pandemic, with everything going on, that we are brought together across nations to actually consider these really important, urgent questions about Chinese Canadian history and the past, present, and future. What I wanted to do is actually introduce the three different speakers, and then we will move forward by asking questions and generating a dialogue about these very significant issues of memory and what it means to all of us at this moment. The first person I want to introduce is Imogene L, a descendant of Cumberland and Vancouver's Chinatown and an anthropologist by trade. Dr. Lim's expertise on Chinese Canadian communities, especially on Vancouver Island, spans well over 2 decades, and her work has included numerous collaborations with local museums. She is a founding member of the Chinese Canadian Historical Society of BC and worked with the BC Legacy Initiatives Advisory Council on the Historic Sites and Celebration book projects. She co-developed the exhibit, 150 Years and Counting, Fighting for Justice on the Coast, and served as a member of the Exhibition Advisory Committee for the Museum of Vancouver's A Seat at the Table. In 2021, she was awarded the Province of BC Medal for Good Citizenship. That's Dr. Lim. Now I want to introduce Paul Yee. Paul Yee was born in a small prairie town and then grew up in Vancouver's Chinatown. He did volunteer projects there in the 1980s and worked as an archivist while doing an MA in Canadian history. He is a published author of over 20 works. His nonfiction includes Saltwater City, an illustrated history of the Chinese in Vancouver. His fiction includes children's books, from picture books to young adult fiction, as well as stories for adults. His work has been adapted for stage and animated film. Since 1988, he has lived in Toronto. Last but not least, Henry Yu. As a history professor, Dr. Yu's research and teaching has been built around collaborations with local community organizations, civic institutions such as museums, and multiple levels of government. He is passionate about helping Canadians unlearn the cultural and historical legacies of colonialism, and to be inspired by the often hidden and untold stories of those who struggled against racism and made Canadian society more inclusive and just. He served on the advisory group for the City of Vancouver's apology consultation process for historical discrimination against people of Chinese descent from 2016 to 2017 that resulted in the City of Vancouver's formal apology for its historical discrimination against its Chinese Canadian residents on April 22nd, 2018. Dr. Yu was on the founding board of the Chinese Canadian Museum of BC and the Chinese Canadian Historical Society of BC. So welcome. As I said, it is an honor to be here with these distinguished panelists. And I was charged with asking questions to start the conversation rolling. So this is the first one, and it's really about considering museums as sites for memory, and what that might mean, and how, when, and where we enter into this history. So this is the question. Places of memory not only are sites of reclamation, but they are also our sites for restitution and social justice. I have very clear memories of learning about all of your work in the late 1980s and early 90s, which is when I began working at the Museum of Chinese in the Americas. Now, some 3 or 4 decades later, may I ask you to reach back in time to let us know how you developed your knowledge of Chinese Canada and to tell us what inspired you to enter this work. And I should add, and to remain in it. So Dr. Lim, could we begin with you, please?
Okay. I have a somewhat unusual background in the sense that my direction to Chinese Canadian history was kind of a zigzaggy kind of way of getting here. Because I will say that growing up, I was the banana in the sense that I grew up basically in a white community. So I was always subverting my Chinese Canadian identity. And at some point I started to lean into it. And part of that is thinking about where my grandfather came from. So I have a little bit of a PowerPoint. So I'm going to show that to you so you get a sense of what I'm talking about, and also where I'm coming from. So the image that you see is Cumberland, and it's roughly 1910. So a lot of people, when they think of Chinese Canadian history, they think of the large urban areas. And so I think part of my being here is to remind people that actually the majority of Chinese Canadians came from smaller locations. So my grandfather basically came to Cumberland more or less directly. And because I know the audience is mixed from Canada and the United States, not everyone has seen a page from the General Register of Chinese Immigration. So because of how my grandfather's name was spelt, he's listed twice in the General Register of Chinese Immigration. So in this particular slide, it's 1890, you can see his name, and there's a little circle there, it says fees paid. That's the head tax. He paid $50. And I've got this horizontal reddish line, and that is my grandfather. So you see he's paid 50, and I know it's him because it names the village that he came from, Lom Ukde. So then in 1910, so I should actually say that in that last slide, it says that he was a laundryman. So that's interesting. He's a laundryman, just a regular Joe. And then in 1910, you see that his name is spelt slightly differently, and he's now a merchant. And because he's a merchant, he brings in my grandmother and he brings in my uncle. And what's interesting to me, I only noticed this recently, even though I've had this document sort of for a while, that the port or place of registration was Nanaimo. And I'm in Nanaimo now. So here I am, connected to Cumberland, but also connected to this place that I work at. And then in 1924, he passes away. Look, his name has changed again because of spelling. And this is the date he passed away. So it's April 27th. And so it says in this article, and it's from the Cumberland Islander, it says that he was in Cumberland for 30 years. So like I said, from 1890, in 4 years, he basically got himself up to Cumberland and stayed there. And one of the things that I wasn't aware of, it says that he was president of the Chinese Masonic Lodge. So if you think of the sort of impact that he must have played, it was significant. He was the president of the Chinese Masonic Lodge. So you think of Chinese associations, these associations were quite meaningful. The other point is that he left 9 children. So 1924 is interesting because in 1923 was the Chinese Immigration Act. So my grandmother was left with these individuals or with these children, and the Chinese Immigration Act comes into place. So what people don't realize is that it affected those within the country, and that is you had to register within 12 months. If you did not register, it was a $500 fine and or jail sentence. So my grandmother registered all the kids. So here's my father. And I always point this out, that in Canada, because we were a colony, the Dominion of Canada, there was a Department of Immigration and Colonization, and specifically a Chinese Immigration Service. And then the fine print, that there was a controller of Chinese immigration, and that this particular certificate, which so many people have from that time period, does not establish legal status in Canada. And I would say that by sort of searching for this information and being situated in Nanaimo, my connection to Chinese Canadian history really blossomed in many ways because of that Cumberland connection. I'll leave it at that because there's more I could say about Cumberland, but I have colleagues to share the floor with. So over to.
I think it is over to Henry Yu. So if I may ask Henry Yu to also speak.
Oh, thanks, Dorothy. Oh, Imogene finished just as she froze, so I'm glad, I'm glad the technology is working. Thanks everyone for inviting me for the Chinese American Museum in LA, as well as my colleagues at the Chinese Canadian Museum. I guess I came to this. I was born in Vancouver in 1967, which means that I've lived about roughly a third of Canadian history, and that, I guess, when I was growing up, what I was aware of was that for the first 2/3 of Canadian history, organized legal discrimination and racism against Chinese was basically the law of the land. It wasn't until the 1960s that you actually had laws that said you couldn't discriminate based on race and creed and gender. And so one of the things that I think growing up, my grandfather was from Zhongshan County, and he used to take me, because my grandparents raised me, and he used to take me down to Chinatown. It seemed like a long way, but it was probably only about 10 blocks when we were walking. But as a 3-year-old, that's a long way. And he would introduce me to all these Lawakyu, these old timers in Chinatown in the 70s at the time. And I never quite understood why it was so important for him to take me, because he had come in 1923 as a teenager, just before the cutoff that Imogene just showed, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so he'd spent his life, working alongside these men. He was a butcher on the Alaskan cruise lines. He worked for the CPR, and he lived in some sense this iconic bachelor life along with the rest of them. And it was only later that I realized that he would take me down to Chinatown because he wanted to share me as a grandson, because most of them didn't have either children or grandchildren. And so they were spending their days in these cafes, just kind of teasing each other, mocking each other, laughing, but living often in these single room occupancy places in Chinatown. So I think that shaped me, because when I grew up, I did early modern French history. I actually, went to grad school to learn, French history. And somewhere along the line, I think rediscovering that part of me, and that part of me was complex. It's that even though my grandfather, he paid the head tax, or at least someone paid for him because he was only a teenager, but his father before him had come to Canada. His three brothers had come. They were all from this sort of Cantonese side. But then my father and my mother, when they came just before I was born, they had been, that part of the family that couldn't reunite. So we had a split family, and my father was not from Guangdong province. He was, as I said, he was from the north, which meant anything north of Guangdong was Northerners, Bakfengyan. And so my father represented this other kind of more urban background. So I think, when I became a historian, it was really to, in honor of, you could say, my grandfather and sort of what the lives of men like him and those families that were split, what that kind of history was like, as well as my more recent migrant waves. And I'll talk more about that later, but I thought I would just share actually two, when I came back to UBC, where I was an undergraduate, and after teaching at UCLA in the history department in Asian American Studies for 12 years, I came back to UBC, and one of the first things we did was to use those head tax registers that Imogene shared, and we blinded a set of students over 2 years as they data entry, read that handwriting, the faint handwriting, and they created this database of 97,124 entries. And I just want to share quickly two slides that just show you, this was a map that was made of where those people were going. So this is for them between 1910 and 1923. And so you can see, even though the weighted map of Victoria and Vancouver, they were going to big cities, Montreal, Toronto. You can see they were also going to every small town across Canada, because they were taking the same railway they helped build. And they went all the way to the Maritimes, and they had, restaurants, cafes, laundries, stores in every place across Canada. This is where the majority of Canadians live, is in the southern part of Canada. So that's one thing, as part of a project, as I said, I'm sure if I was, talking about justice, I should probably pay for the, the glasses for those poor students who had to look at the red head tax registers. The other one I wanted to share actually was this, which again is an indication of the, I don't know if it's showing up for everyone right now, but it should be a list of the county origins. And this, it's because when the Chinese came, they, basically everybody, had to, tell what village they're from, all this information. And so we have this incredible information on this 97. You were surveilled because you weren't wanted. The head tax registry created lots of information. And so you can see that 99% of those who came to Canada before 1947 from China were from just 8 counties. The 4 counties, Siyup, Samyup, and then Zhongshan, those 8 counties, 99%. Right? That kind of singular origin of those men, like my grandfather's friends, that really, I think, in many ways, shows this history of, the dominance of Cantonese, and they went to the United States, they went to New Zealand, they went to Australia, all around what I and others are called the Cantonese Pacific. And yet, like my father, there's also later, starting really in the 1940s and 50s, more and more people coming from, ethnic Chinese backgrounds from around the world, from, Southeast Asia, from the Caribbean, from Latin America, but also from mainland China itself, Hong Kong. And so that to me is kind of how I got into this, why I became a researcher, why I became a teacher. So I'll stop there. And
Henry, your stories about how profoundly you were shaped by meeting these older men, and then also it took some years, you have to grow up to understand what is happening. That is so moving, because I can just imagine how much it meant to them. And I think we're really driven and shaped by these kinds of encounters, or these ways of understanding the past that is living yet. And as we move forward, even if we move in other directions and journeys, there's something that brings us back to that. And I want to now introduce the next speaker, Paul Yee, who has one of the things that I think is so important about your work is that you have introduced generations of younger folk and older folk as well into these stories. So I'm very interested to hear more about how you came into this and began your journey.
Thank you, Dorothy. And let me thank the Chinese American Museum of Los Angeles for hosting this event. I'm delighted to be here tonight. Well, for me, it all started in the 1970s. In 1974, I was still in high school, and I went to a meeting in Vancouver's Chinatown where some young people were trying to put on a youth conference about identity and awareness, Chinese Canadians. At that time, I had absolutely no interest in any of that kind of thing about Chinatown or identity or whatever. But one of my teachers insisted that I go to these meetings. So there I was sitting at a meeting, bored and impatient. And somebody in the meeting said, oh yeah, and we've got to talk about the Chinese railway workers. And I blurted out without even thinking, why would you want to do that? They were just a bunch of coolies. Well, that was my eureka moment, and my life changed forever after that. I reeled from my own words, and right away I saw how brainwashed I was about my own history and community, despite having grown up right there in Chinatown, having gone to Chinese school for 10 years, you know, all of that, it just seemed to have gone out the window. I was astounded at how insidious that process of brainwashing had been, because, you know, no one ever said to me, you know, Paul, Chinese railway workers are irrelevant. Yet somehow I had managed to pick up this hugely negative thought all on my own by just growing up in Vancouver in Canada. So after that, I got involved in Vancouver's Chinatown, fundraising, radio, protests, festivals, English classes. But I have to tell you, Chinese Canadian history was not out in the front. Other needs, other parts of Chinese Canadian culture captured people's imagination and attention. Parades, newcomer services, Cantonese opera, new ties to the People's Republic of China. But it was during that time that I learned about the very exciting Asian American movement that was going on in Berkeley and San Francisco and Los Angeles. I recall reading these books and anthologies that were coming out of high schools and universities about community, history, political engagement, and Asian American history, literature, and theater. These are just all emerging. And it was all very inspiring. But it wasn't until 1986 that Chinese Canadian history finally got pushed to the front. Now, 1986 was Vancouver's centennial. The city celebrated its 100th birthday, and parties and celebrations were planned throughout the city for the entire year. So in Chinatown, the Chinese Culture Center says, hey, why don't we do a museum type exhibit to tell 100 years of the Chinese in Vancouver? So that was the idea. And so a bunch of volunteers, we went out, we did the research, we tracked down artifacts, costumes, photos, we interviewed people, we created a storyline, and then we built this exhibit, one wall at a time, in a hall that was the size of a basketball court. So we had a museum designer and a graphic artist come in to help make the exhibit look professional. And it was called Saltwater City, Ham Sui Phao, which is what the Hoi San folk called Vancouver, to differentiate it from the other major cities of British Columbia, which also had Chinese names. So the exhibit itself started in the 19th century of China, moved through the gold rush in BC, the railway building that led to Vancouver's birth, and then all the industries around Vancouver where the Chinese worked. And then we showed how Chinatown grew up as a self-reliant place with a vibrant sense of family and politics. Now, 1986 was probably the right time for this exhibit because there was a real sense of the changing of the guard. By 1986, there had been 20 years of steady immigration from Hong Kong. And it was clear, especially after the 1970s, that the immigrants were going to dominate. They had revitalized Chinatown. They brought in Hong Kong culture, Hong Kong movies, TV series, candle pop, the whole kit and caboodle. There was Chinese radio. It was Chinatown. So it felt that in 1986, we had to kind of give our last salute to the pioneers before handing this Chinatown of ours over to the new generation. So that's how I got involved. And out of that exhibit came 2 films at the Illustrated History book. And that's how I got started. And that's how I think community history began in 1986. Back to you, Dorothy.
Thank you so much. I was thinking from 1986 is actually when I started working at what is now the Museum of the Chinese in the Americas. And I remember your book in the bookstore, and all those books were such a revelation. That's when I met Judy Young. And when she had the exhibition that became the pictorial history before Berkeley. And I see Imogene has a hand up. Dr. Lim, did you want to add something to that too?
Yeah, well, like Henry talked about, being in grad school and having that awakening. And I would say that being in grad school also had an impact on me because as Paul has indicated, there wasn't that sense of a reason to celebrate Chinese Canadian history, or even awareness of it, like it was simply, gold rush or railway, and there was nothing in between. And then so I did my graduate studies at Brown, and it was like, oh, because there was ethnic studies, right? So I became aware that, well, maybe, there's more to life than what I thought there was, in the sense of acknowledging that history that was part of my history. So I didn't talk about it because we were focusing on the Canadian stuff, but I ended up with a postdoc, and it was looking at Chinese food. So I was going back to my roots because I am the daughter of a restaurateur, a Chinatown restaurateur. And I know that gave me an advantage to talking to some of the people, because I said, like my father worked in a restaurant in Chinatown. I was like, oh, and they said, oh, I'll talk to you because you know what it means to be a child of a restaurateur, because the hours, right? You really don't see your parents. So that was when it was like, oh, okay, because if you think about what I did for my doctorate, like people look at me, they don't realize. So like, I'm like Gary Okihiro. I did African studies. So I speak Swahili. My any Chinese dialect is, it's not very good, but I could have a conversation in Swahili. So that transition from, being this sort of Africanness to rediscovery of my roots and being proud of who I am and wanting to do right by my ancestors, So I, if I didn't go to grad school in the States, I don't know whether that would have happened, because like I said, there was this vibrancy. So I think I became aware of you early on in the Association for Asian American Studies. Like if I was in Canada, I don't think that would have happened. So this sort of meeting up with people and being in the right place at the right time allowed me to do what I've been doing. And like I said, rediscovering, not that I didn't know that I came from Cumberland's Chinatown, but I had cause to become an activist, a citizen activist when it came to Cumberland, because Nowadays, people look at Cumberland and they say, oh, look, it's got this Cold Creek Historic Park. Isn't it so amazing? Huge park. And, you know, it commemorates not only the early Chinese community, but also the Japanese Canadian community. It's because I got a call in 2001 of November. That's why that park exists, because I got in there, and I still remember that I wrote two people that I was friends with in the Asian American Studies community. It's like, we have to do a letter writing campaign. We got to do something. And then all of a sudden, the village of Cumberland got letters from NYU, Washington State University, UCL, you know, like they got letters, and like, why are we getting these letters? You know, politics, it's a village. We just do what we do, right? And it got this sort of notoriety. And like I said, I am still involved in Cumberland.
I remember this, the university connection is interesting because I remember when I was studying history at UBC as an undergrad, I'd go through all the books looking for Chinese Canadian history, look through all the periodicals. And there were two main topics at that time that were covered in the history books. One was about anti-Chinese racism, about all the laws that were passed, what the newspapers were saying, what the politicians did, all this huge legacy of racism. And the other topic that was around at that time came from sort of sociologists who were really interested in studying Chinatown associations because they saw this sort of transplanted Chinese type organization brought to the New World and flourishing. And so these are the two main things that I got to read as an undergraduate. And I remember thinking, is that all there is? It kind of made me felt that is the Chinese only came over to Canada and North America to set up associations. Where was the stuff about our work, about what we did in the economy? And I think that's what led me to kind of really focus in on Vancouver, because it was a real hub of industry, of various kinds of industries where the Chinese worked. You know, in sawmills, in the ferries, in agriculture. It was a very, very diverse range of industries, and none of that was available in the books, not at that time.
I think it's so reason why museums are so important as well. Like, you know, I when I was little, again, I think, you know, just paralleling what Imogene and Paul have said, I didn't see myself or my grandfather or people like us in museum spaces, you know, these sacred spaces of the colonial museum, you could say, these big institutions. And you know, and you can discover yourself, you know, I love Imogene's story of grads. I found Amerasia Journal published at UCLA's Asian American Studies Center, you know, and E184, I can tell you the Library of Congress, you know, where everything, all of a sudden you're looking and everything on the shelf is interesting, and not just Chinese American history, which was E184 and ethnic American histories, but, you know, Japanese American, you know, all this spectrum, I think of the untold stories, just to parallel today's theme. And I think that's why I stopped being an early modern French historian. I literally went, you know, this speaks to me, and this needs to be researched, and this needs to be something that, you know, and going up to the New York Chinatown, you know, museum and walking in when it was really small. This was before it's new, big, fancy, you know, back, I think when you were there, it was like, it seemed like a room full of stuff, you know, lots of old newspapers, artifacts. And to me, to see that that's something that was, you know, again, possible. And Saltwater City had happened, you know, in Paul's exhibit in the 80s, but then it went away. You know, and there was a book, and then there was a second edition of the book, which also details later migrations. So we're so thankful to Paul for staying with that story. But I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, I think in the early 2000s, when it was actually some of the people at UBC said, can you help, you know, build some programs and that are like the ones at UCLA, the ones where younger students can continually learn, and we could help work with, you know, community orgs. Again, something that was pioneered, so to speak, to use that term advisedly, in places like Berkeley and in Los Angeles and and across the United States. Wing Luke Museum, I think in Seattle, the Portland now Chinese Museum. There's these, that I think is something that perhaps, we've had in fits and starts in Canada. But I think that's one of the reasons why this site of memory, just going back to your original question of, you need a place where people can, encounter, engage, and maybe they've lost a lot of who they are because of the way education, has pounded it out of them. Languages, we have a seat at the table when we did the two exhibitions. We made sure it was trilingual, Cantonese, Mandarin, English, so that elders could encounter, but also young people could get it in English. But you'd also have, simplified text, traditional Chinese characters, as well as English. And so there's this way of, and Imogene, again, with, lots of voices to make sure that it was small town life was also in there, not just the big cities, the Chinatowns across Canada, and because I think part of that was that people moved around. Like, we had stories of people in 26 different places in their lives. There's peripatetic mobility of many of those workers that Paul's talking about, but also both in Canada and the United States, that the main way to get into the United States after exclusion was to sneak in through Canada or Mexico. And so that kind of thing where borders and national identity actually leads us to miss things. And so again, thinking of this Cantonese Pacific, like the Black Atlantic, as a way of thinking of all this mobility and these networks and what was lost too, in terms of memory. And I think if museums can help us, recall and remember and honor those lost stories too.
So the other thing that I was going to come up with in terms of what Henry is saying about the small towns, because, like Vancouver and Victoria, there are sizable museums. So when you go to a community museum, what is it that they collect? So there is, in fact, a lot of debate going on in terms of what is the focus of those museums. And given that, in many of these small places, yes, they did have vibrant, diverse communities, but because many of them were attached to resource labor, when the resources dry up, they move to larger city centers. So that means that who becomes the board members of those archives and museums? They don't even realize that there is this very, very rich history of other people. And when I've spoken, at some of these meetings, and I said, oh, by the way, there were Chinese. So I'm thinking of the island. This won't mean anything to people not from Vancouver, but when you go to a place like Cobble Hill or Chemainus on the island, most people think of it as a very quote unquote white community. But at one time, there was a sizable Chinese population that they had associations. So when I speak of it, it's like, really? Was there something there? And, so you're being asked, it's like, well, I don't know everything, right? Nobody saved these things. So those families that moved to Vancouver or whatever, one hopes that there was a family historian in the group, that, the pack rat, that someone has documentation to say, yes, my family came from this small town. And that's why these kinds of conversations are good, because this morning I was on the radio to sort of advertise it, and somebody emailed me and said, you've inspired me. I'm going to keep looking at my family history, and I am a descendant of Cumberland. It's like, yes,
Well, I think I'll break in here so I can earn my keep as moderator. But what it really shows me also is just how passionate and important this history is. That you've been doing it literally for decades. And one of the things that I also draw from your conversation is the importance of the everyday things that are often taken for granted. I wanted to tell you, Imogene, the documents that you showed were really wonderful. And we can recover some of those and use them as places of reclamation. But one of the things that is really striking about this conversation to me is how in your different efforts, you are doing so many diverse activities to remember and commemorate and inspire people about this. So this leads me to the next question, as I, again, want to earn my keep. I'm going to ask, from your different perspectives, what is your vision for the future of Chinese Canadian history? In many ways, I think, and I was going to say, Henry, not just E184, but HD 8069, I think was also important.
Yeah.
Yes, because you literally would go into your undergraduate library, and if you were lucky, there was a shelf and a half, excuse me. And so what we see here with you three, you really have been building the history up. So I'd really like to know more about what are your dreams for the future? Like, what goals and projects are you currently developing? And where do what do you want to do now? We've reached a certain point where there is obviously more acknowledgement. Just when I read your bios, the long years of activism it took to get recognition of the injustice that was done. And so I think the audience would love to hear more about what you're thinking about moving forward, particularly because we have been caught in this pandemic. We are in a world of omnipresent violence. You cannot turn on the TV without reflecting on these issues. And I think, I want to come back to your political project and your passion for this, because there is something that you see that I'd like to learn more about. So could I start with Imogene? Could you start, please? Or you can as my students say, I'll popcorn it over to
yeah, popcorn it over.
Or to Paul.
Well, one of the projects so the question is about the future of history, our vision for history.
Yeah.
I have to admit, my vision for history puts it more into the arts, into the field of imagination. And I think I want to see more people taking the history and using their imagination to grow it. And I've seen it already in the exhibits that the Chinese Canadian Museum has done. They have done amazing things with the artifacts and images that are available as historical artifacts, but they've made them contemporary. They jump out at you, they grab you, they take you places. So I think it's about the human imagination and history. So, but there's one other piece that I want to throw into there, and this has to do with the project that I'm working on right now. So right now I'm translating for a new opera called Chinatown that will open in Vancouver in September of 2022. Now, what is striking about this opera is that the entire first act is sung in Huaisanfa,
wow,
the rural dialect, while the second act is sung mostly in English. So this is an opera written by Madeleine Tien, a renowned Canadian author, and the music scored by an equally renowned Canadian composer, Alice Ping Yi Ho. And the opera is about two friends, two of these so-called bachelor men and their lives in Canada from the 1890s to the 1960s. It kind of focuses in on Vancouver, because as they work, they eventually drop in on Vancouver from all the small towns that they visit. But the story is really about friendship, about what you're willing to do when your family is far away, but when other needs, equally important, are really close by. But here's the interesting thing. At first, Madeleine and the opera company, something called City Opera of Vancouver, planned to use Cantonese in that first act. But then what they did was they took the opera in draft form to public consultations with the Chinese community. And what people in the community said was, if you really want to be faithful to the actual history lived by these two men, if you really want to give texture to the actual Chinatown that they came from, then the Chinese libretto should be sung in Huaisanfa, which was the dominant dialect of all the Chinatowns of North America up until the 1960s. So Madeline and the opera company opted for Hoi San Va. And then once the music was composed and the translations done, we took this back to the community again so that they could hear it in Hoi San Va, and they could follow it because we gave them a bilingual libretto. And this time we heard about what they liked or what they didn't like or what they found confusing in the opera. So while the story and the music and the stage design are really dazzling in this opera, what I really found amazing was the public consultation process that this company decided on. They recognize that Chinese Canadians today are really quite well informed about their history, well, at least compared to 1986, when Saltwater City came along. Chinese Canadians are much more aware of their history, and they're able to ask tough questions about how it gets presented now. So for the opera, the consultations let people know that their sense of history and their sense of community were important, and that they, as community members, had a stake in the artistic works that were coming forward. I mean, after all these artistic works come from the community, right? Mm-hmm. And then they become part of the community. They become part of the community's memory and history later on. So that's what I find fascinating about sort of the future of history and the arts and consultations. Back to you guys.
I would agree with Paul, because when it's in the arts, it makes it more accessible to so many other people. Like a lot of people will go to an art gallery, but they won't go necessarily, or a performance, but they won't necessarily go to a museum because they have a very limited imagination of what a museum might be. And it could be because they're from the type of town that they're coming from. When you're in larger places, more money can be spent in museums. So the exhibit can be much more dynamic, but you know, when you go to these smaller places, they are really limited with what they have. So when you have an art exhibit, you know, like in the arts, it really does reach out to so many more, because I'm thinking like last summer, I saw Karen Tam's Autumn Tigers, and it was like, oh, wow, this is really neat, because she's making use of history, like history from 20th century, but also into the present. She had one where it deals with the contemporary racism with the historic racism, and that's like, whoa, you know, because when you look at it, you don't think it's much of anything, and then you look very carefully at the images, and then you realize what's actually happening in this sort of background. And it really, like, you could spend hours just staring at various pieces of the art. And like I said, it was in Campbell River, and I'm thinking, you know, so that's, again, you don't know the island, but it's reaching a different demographic than those from Victoria or from Vancouver. So it's providing what I see as anti-Asian racism education. And that's being processed in a very different way than having somebody lecture to you. You can see it, and then you can read what the artist has to say. You know, it's much richer in that sense.
What I loved about the A Place at the Table exhibit, the pop-up exhibit in Chinatown, was that you guys, the Chinese Canadian Museum, commissioned artwork for it. It was the best part of the exhibit for me, seeing these huge platters. It was absolutely mind-boggling and spine-tingling for me. So, you know, so that for me was where the arts and history came together so cleverly. Well done by you guys.
Thanks, Paul. And I think that's also, Paul sort of said my answer too, which is that, you know, even though I'm a quote professional historian and you know, that it's my day job and I get paid for it, it actually, to me, I don't live in the past. It's you know, whether it's my students or whether it's the people who come to, you know, seat at the table, you know, it's about bringing history alive in the present, but also bringing people together. And that's why I think it's so important that even though there's been so much loss that we have to recover in terms of, those histories that, frankly, because of exclusion and discrimination and racism, we weren't collecting a lot. We were surveilling, and we were, getting info so we could, better keep out the Chinese, but then we weren't collecting what they were doing. And so the kind of food, farms, the funerals, that kind of daily life, as well as the ritual lives, weren't really being kept in archives and kept in museum collections. But to me, it's impossible to unmake an absence, to create collections that were never collected in the past. And so that's why I think oral histories, story gathering, what does the past mean in the present? And not only for those of descent, I happen again on my mother's side to have, descended 4 generations from those early migrants. But what about people like on my father's side? What about those people who are new arrivals from mainland China or who were from Hong Kong, but don't have that connection to those rural villages in Guangdong? I think that's part of the present kind of challenge. And for me, the future of Chinese Canadian Museum or any museum in some sense as a site of meaning making is that meaning making has to be for the present and for the future. And I love Paul talking about the use of a topolect or a dialect, a form of speech, the si up wa or hoisava, that is perhaps disappearing in use. That intergenerationally, it's only elders now who still speak it. But taking students to some of those villages in southern China every summer and having them encounter those elders, help them in the kitchen making meals together. And I think that's, to me, where that intergenerational knowledge transfer, to use the fancy term of just having what is our elders and knowledge bearers in the communities, be able to pass that on and know that there won't be forgotten, and maybe we're not going to, I'm not speaking, Zhongsanhua at home because my grandmother's gone. And so she was who I used to speak with, but the memory of speaking with her and what I can pass on to my kids, about, honoring that past, but not being frozen to trying to replicate it or being just nostalgic for it. When we talk about affect in museums, with emotional, we tried in the Chinatown, for instance, in that A Seat at the Table exhibit in Chinatown, we tried to kind of invoke, and evoke certain emotions, a sense of connection, a sense of bonding for anyone, So yes, those were descended, but also the people who were ethnic Chinese, so to speak, but they weren't tied to those families. I know from other, I have colleagues who talk about the difficulties in Japanese American, JANM and Los Angeles, as well as Japanese Nikkei in Burnaby here, of how, unless you're descended from a family that was removed during the Second World War, are you authentically really Japanese Canadian or Japanese American? And this is an issue because, if we're so tied to the past that if you aren't from the right, authentic experience, then you don't belong in the Chinese Canadian community. I think there has to be a binding, you could say, in the present moment as well as into the future. And I learned that you could say that being in the States and seeing how, being Asian American or Asian Pacific Islander was a coalitional political kind of act. It wasn't one where you needed to have shared, the same past, but sharing in some sense, the effects of white supremacy, the effects of anti-Asian racism right now and violence. And that is a binding agent in the present. And so giving a history of where anti-Asian exclusion comes from, I get phoned all the time, journalists, every time there's a spectacular moment of violence, like, can you explain this? And I can't explain what someone is doing right now, in terms of a racist act, but what I can do is put it into the context of this long history of exclusion and racism and violence. So that's I guess my answer about the past and the present.
I'm going to jump in here because I've been getting some messages to have more comparative context between Chinese Canadian history and Chinese American history in terms of exclusion. And I think it's also because our audiences are located in different sites. Well, actually all over.
Oh, yeah.
But would you be able to just share some of the similarities and differences that you see? Because I think what has been emerging from this conversation too is that there are shared spaces,
Yeah.
shared political spaces, shared educational spaces. Clearly, Chinese exclusion influenced what was happening in Canada and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so if you wouldn't mind drawing some of that, the broad strokes of that to help fill out the picture, that'd be helpful.
Sure, and I'll volunteer myself, since I taught at both Chinese American and Asian American history, as well as Chinese Canadian, Chinese and Asian Canadian history in both places. And I mean, for me, and if you want, I'll put a site to an article if you want it in a little bit more detail for Asian Canadian versus Asian American history, the similarities and differences. But just as really at a high level, I think in particular in looking at the Cantonese Pacific, you could say that the networks of those who are leaving these rural villages, the 8 counties, the literally, a couple hundred villages in each of these counties at the most, they were going to Australia, or what the Australian colonies, to New Zealand, to North America. And, for them, it was all Gumsan. It was all Gold Mountain. It was a kind of a dream, and they would have relatives all across. So that's why, for everyone in the audience, if you go, yeah, I have a cousin in Vancouver and you're in San Francisco, it is because, the kinds of origin places in these rural villages, people were going out and going to different places. And so you could say for Chinese kind of migrant networks in the 19th, all the way really into the mid 20th century, this is one large transoceanic set of networks. It was tied also to those that went to Southeast Asia, at least the Cantonese. But for Southeast Asia, you had all these people coming from Fujian, or the Hokkien speakers, from the port of Chaodou. Those were actually into Southeast Asia before the Cantonese. And so the Cantonese came late to Southeast Asia. And those who went to Southeast Asia from other parts, of southern China or the South Coast did not come across. That county origins that I showed you, that's very similar to the United States in terms of people who are coming from those 8 counties. And you notice there's virtually no one from Fujian. It was less than 0.01%. And if you're asking me, why did all these people keep going through the port of Hong Kong into Southeast Asia, but not a single one of these people who are going into Southeast Asia who are, Minnan speakers or Hokkien speakers, why didn't they go across? Who knows? I think it has to do with, again, existing networks, following people, or, many of us aren't that brave. We follow others, so chain migration effects led to the creation of Cantonese Pacific. I think one of the most important differences in that comparative context, though, as we get later racisms or the way in which exclusion occurs, is the rhythms of exclusion and the tools. And so the Chinese Immigration Act or Exclusion Act of 1882 in the United States, you don't have an outright exclusion until 1923. Between 1885 and 1923, you have a head tax. So it slows the migrations. But still 97,000 plus people still come in paying, from $50 up to $500 during that time. $500 is like 2 full years of wages. So you're trying to pay that off for a long time. It meant that you would not bring non-productive people over. So you had to be a wealthy merchant to bring a wife or young children. And so that's where that freezing of a kind of bachelor society of these men and workers who could pay off that head tax debt was really shaping, you could say, in Canada. Again, the outright exclusion in the United States, which leads to a lot of paper sons and that also acquired money. And so it meant that I think that mostly male, but is more male in Canada. So the ratios up until the 1940s was upwards of 25, 30 to 1 in terms of gender ratios. It was harder to create families that were split as well because of, again, the timing. a large number, almost, if you look at the records, a lot of Chinese migrants came in the period just before World War I and just before cutting off in 1923. If you look at the United States, that's not the bulk of when Chinese American migration occurred, because and so the rhythms of when people came, of the kinds of laws, the disenfranchisement was different. So I think the other major difference is Wong Kim Ark versus the United States in 1898. Birthright citizenship is given to Chinese American kids, so to speak, who were born in the United States. That does not happen in Canada until 1947. And so you have alien registration. You have these kids who are born in Canada, and yet they get an alien registration card that says that, basically you aren't Canadian, you can't vote. And so the forms of discrimination are different, even though in the end, at a high level, exclusion, persecution, lots of harassing laws that are passed by cities in Vancouver. They're very similar to San Francisco, harassing merchants, taking away licenses so peddlers couldn't deliver vegetables door to door. So there's a lot of similarities and parallels. And it's not about trying to compare which was harsher, but I think the huge difference between that Wong Kim Ark versus the United States made, against a Chinese Canadian challenge or Chinese American challenge, and birthright citizenship, just like with Japanese Canadians versus Japanese Americans, it made a huge difference during the Second World War, that Japanese Americans, 2/3 were, American citizens by birth. You did not have that same thing in Canada. And so it was much harsher in terms of the dispossession in Canada than it was in the United States for Japanese Canadians. But those are some of the high level things in which what was done by the Canadian state to Chinese. You could say that there was a lot more effective tools if you were a white supremacist, if you were in Canada.
I'm so going to use that clip, Henry, to teach you history. Thank you so much. That was really illuminating. I think we need to turn to the wonderful questions coming from the audience. And I wanted to summarize some of them. Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging and dropping your questions in the chat. A number of the questions center around how will the Chinese Canadian community move forward, given the fact that there are different migration generations, languages. There's a lot of people who are multiracial and have multiple communities. And so I wanted to ask the panelists, what do how do you, this importance of a political space where folks can come together across time and space, actually. How do you see that coming about in your work or in your activism, whether it's through an art exhibition or an opera or a museum? How can the museum function as a landscape, in this way?
I think I can start in on this. Museums in the past, when they thought of Chinatowns, they sort of did that isolation. It's just Chinatown. It's like, wait a minute, Chinatowns weren't only for Chinese people. Like, there's a lot of mixing that goes on. So so when we think of museum exhibits, we have to remember, what are the intersections of communities? Is it schools? And common one is food, like everybody comes for food, and it's not restricted to quote unquote Chinese people only. And I think about, like I said, I'm the daughter of a restaurateur. So I remember the kind of what I thought was authentic Chinese, but I know that it wasn't truly authentic because they couldn't get the ingredients back in the day that they can now. So there was a Canadianization of Chinese food. So all these people were eating it. It didn't matter, So like I said, I think we need to sort of acknowledge the intersection of a number of different themes and bring those out, whether it's how we teach it or in the museum space. And I'm going to go back to the Karen Tam exhibit, because in her exhibit, Autumn Tigers, she included, there were, I think, 2 pieces, maybe there were more than 2 pieces, of a local indigenous artist. So looking at that sort of connection between how something is represented as well as the symbolic meaning combined with, you know, what Karen was trying to portray, you could see that similarity. So there is a way to bring different communities together and, you know, gain food and art.
I'm not so sure about the community moving together forward, anything like that. I think the community is much too diverse to be thought of in any way having joint interests. I see the various pieces of the community dipping into Chinese Canadian history whenever they're interested, if there's an event, if there's an exhibit, if there's something that catches their attention. Otherwise, I think these various pieces of Chinese Canadian community, whether it's new immigrants, 5th generation, Hapa, whatever, they all have different agendas, they have different needs, they have different expressions, and they all should flourish. And so to think, to be asked, how do you think the community should move together? I have no idea, because I don't think it's one community. I think it's so diverse now, and we should be encouraging that diversity, a diversity of expression, of investigations, all of that, so that people can move forward at their own pace, in their own direction. That's how things will really flourish. If we want to keep bringing people under one umbrella, that just seems to be, you know, so conformist, or you need agreement. And why do we need agreement? Let's just let things happen. Sorry, that's me.
I love the idea of a multiplicity of kind of not just voices, but mirroring experiences. So again, going to the exhibit, the Seat at the Table in Chinatown, one of my favorite parts of opening day was actually there was a reporter, and he was interviewing my co-curator, or the co-curator, Denise Fong, who's done multiple exhibits herself. And at some point when she was answering, he kind of got distracted and looked at a photo behind her and said, "Oh, is that the old Aberdeen Mall, the Top Gun dim sum restaurant?" And started going off about, you know, this restaurant, which was iconic of the Hong Kong Chinese coming to Richmond, BC, and it was the first Hong Kong mall, and it was the first dim sum restaurant where they didn't push the carts around, but you ordered what you wanted on a piece of paper and it came right away, so you didn't have to wait for the hagao to arrive, you know, and hope that it wasn't run out by the time it got to your table and things like that. And there was a bowling alley that scored your score automatically. Like, it was funny because he found this moment of mirroring, because he thought that Chinese Canadian history was, you know, all about the old timers. It didn't include people from Hong Kong, people like him. I think, you know, and so literally, I think he just kind of didn't listen to the answer and then he began to talk about that. And that was precisely one of the things we were trying to do, was to have these, they weren't hidden Easter eggs. They were these Easter eggs in plain sight for people to, you know, see it and go, wait a minute, that's actually my story, you know, or the story of my family. And it didn't always have to be kind of really specifically ethnic. So we had a slideshow, for instance, in the Museum of Vancouver's A Seat at the Table, that was just showing domestic life. And we tried to get as many shots of, you know, you could say the happy snappies from family kind of events, but we wanted to kind of, you know, there's an absence of that representation. I remember, talking to one of the people who really helped mentor me, Judy Young, of, you know, that everyday life and family, domestic life of things that you never saw pictures of, even in Sears Roebuck catalogs. There's always, you know, you never saw the Chinese Canadian family around Christmas or something, or around the dinner table. And so we tried to source lots and lots of these domestic photos. So again, anybody we thought could see themselves in it. And I think that's really important for how not just a multiplicity of voices and a diversity of backgrounds and perspectives, but also how the actual materials in exhibits allow for different kinds of moments of connection and affective bonding and provoking and evoking emotions. And so I think that's one of the things I'd say is really important in museums, is because these are spaces that are meaning making. And so how do you trigger, and food, that's why I seat at the table with this double meaning of having to fight and literally die in order to have a seat at the table in terms of society and rights, but also a seat at the table meaning lots and lots of birthday parties and celebrations at restaurants, and how Chinese restaurants became the site of meaning making for so many families.
So maybe the question is then, how do you make generative interventions where you make that intervention and out of it more comes or more opens up or different ways of seeing? I want to make sure to get to some of the generative questions of the audience. So I'm going to ask one question. In your research or studies, what kinds of cross-pollinations have you learned about with early diaspora Chinese communities and Indigenous Native peoples and communities? I saw an art exhibit in Victoria a few years back that touched on this and was fascinating and eye-opening.
Maybe I'll just jump right in that, if you can, there's a film called All Our Father's Relations that was made by Al Yoshizawa and Sarah Ling, based on the Chinese Musqueam family, the Grants of Musqueam. And that's a wonderful way. Cedar and Bamboo is another film that was made earlier, again, about Chinese Indigenous relations. And again, that erased history. And that really was erased, meaning there's lots and lots of family formation because it was this overwhelmingly male migrant networks that were coming into Canada. And you could say that compared to many parts of the United States, the dispossession of Indigenous peoples was at a different pace. So in British Columbia in particular, the clearance into, to these reserves and the Indian Act being, being applied, you could say, to break Indigenous families up, to take kids away. It occurred at a moment where a lot of Chinese men had actually, created families that opened stores in Indigenous communities. So that history is actually a long-standing one. Senator Lillian Dick, in Saskatchewan, his or her father was a Chinese restaurant owner. Her mother was from the local, Indigenous community. In fact, her mother's sister also married a Chinese restaurateur. There's North Battleford, Saskatchewan. And so there's actually lots and lots of this erased history. It was erased by the application of the Indian Act to basically take away Native status, this a formal government category of are you Native or not. And if a woman married a non-Native husband, her Native status was taken away. The children could not live on reserve. And so part of All Our Father's Relations, the film, is about how the Grant children were struck off the tribal role, and then they had to live in Chinatown because they could not live with their Musqueam mother because they weren't Musqueam by definition of the government. And so this kind of breaking of families as part of, you could say, this deliberate eradication of Indigenous culture, language, and community, it had this horrific effect also on, I think, many people who had their families destroyed. There's no other way to put it. It was just, and I think that legacy lives on in Canada. There's people who had a Chinese grandfather and know nothing about who that man was, had no connection or connectivity, no chance to actually have a familial heritage. And I think especially for many communities where the passage of knowledge down is through oral, means, like that intergenerational, you're told who you belong to, who you are, of what community you are. And the breaking of that, you could say, has been really damaging, and in many ways the loss is incalculable.
So I wanted to pick up on what Henry was saying about, the grandfathers that are not known. And part of the, yes, there is that erasure, but for many of the men, their wives are either second wives, whether they're indigenous or not, and they're younger. So these men are, dying, and then they're left, these families are left with young children. So they grew up not really knowing their fathers because they had died when they were young. So even though, I have quote unquote 2 Chinese grandparents, my grandfather died so early on that, like even in Cumberland, when people talk about the descendants that are there, the Lim family kind of gets lost because the family left in 1928. So if my grandfather hadn't died, there would have been more of that presence as such. So I can understand how in these other communities, yes, there could be viewed as the stigma of having a mixed marriage, but also that those men did not survive because of that age difference. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that because of the discriminatory legislation, they couldn't bring wives. And then when they finally found somebody to marry and to have children, they were much, much older.
Another question from the audience. This is for Dr. Lim. Are there any histories of the Chinese in Cumberland? My grandmother was born there in 1903.
Okay. I'm trying to think of Philip Lowe, one of the sons of Chunchok Lowe. So Philip Lowe wrote his sort of like a family history. And I remember reading it, but I'm trying to think, like how much is covered, or is it mostly just family? And then so that's the only one that I know of specific to Cumberland and Chinese. There is another book, and it sort of covers all of Cumberland, and there's like a few pages, I should say, maybe a dozen pages that deal with the Chinese community. So there is no quote unquote book that I'm aware of, but as I say, I don't know everything.
Here's another question. I migrated to the US from the Caribbean, where there are large numbers of Hakka, more so in Jamaica than in Trinidad, where I come from, in addition to Cantonese. Since you emphasize a Cantonese majority in the migration to Canada, are there any Hakka in Canada?
Yes, there is. It's a significant proportion of the Cantonese. As many of you know, there was a county that was all after the sort of the internecine war between the locals that claimed to be Cantonese because they arrived from the north as migrants a couple of years, 100 years before the Hakka, and then Hakka got to be called guest people. Even if they've been in Guangdong province for 1,500 years, they're still the guests because they arrived a couple hundred years after the people who call themselves the native Cantonese. But there's actually quite a large number, especially I think in terms of Hakka associations. They have worldwide associations that some of those are, from early Cantonese migrations. So they were amongst those who came from Guangdong province. There's also a lot who have come from Caribbean and all around the world. Mauritius, there's a very large Chinese Mauritius population, for instance, which is mostly Hakka. Jamaica, Toronto has a lot of Hakka. There's a wonderful community historian there. I can pass the name on in the chat, and so there's been actually a really high sense of that kind of history. One of the wonderful directors of Ryerson is from a Chinese Jamaican and mixed Black Chinese Jamaican family. So there's a lot. I think Canada after 1967, when it removed white supremacy from its immigration policy, you had in fact a really complex global migration. There are more Chinese or people from India of Chinese, background in Canada than there are in India. that there's, in the Metro Toronto area, there's like, I think, I remember about 5 years ago, the count was 28 Chinese Indian style restaurants, in the Metro Toronto area, stretching across the whole Metro Toronto. There's 3 in Vancouver, for instance. They're all from families that ran Chinese restaurants in Calcutta and Mumbai and other places like that. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think that's what's exciting about an awareness in Canada of these, again, that diversity of origin, that there's no single community, as I think Paul's already made that point. In New York, I know the Museum of Chinese Americas, went from being a Chinatown museum to the Museum of Chinese Americas, partly around this sort of broader sensibility of who was in New York, who counted themselves and identified as being of Chinese origin. You've had that similar, I think, kind of process happen over the last 40, 50 years. Peranakan from Southeast Asia, who are like 10 generations from Chinese, from now what is now Indonesia, or from what is now Malaysia. Again, that kind of sense of the complexity of the migrants who left what is now southern China for 2,000 years, not to create some kind of epic mythology about this. There's this book by a wonderful scholar named Lin Pan called Sons of the Yellow Emperor, which I think ends up creating too much of a kind of mythic, unified, unitary notion of that diaspora. I don't even, to be honest, like to use the word diaspora, because I see a lot of these migrations that were networked in different ways. And they never were a single network. And so I think what you see now in North America, in both the United States and Canada, is the overlapping of these tertiary, 4th level, 5th level kinds of migrations. Just like you see also in South Asian migration, there are people who left the Indian subcontinent 4 generations ago to East Africa, to South Africa. And then in 1968, lots of Indian Ugandans ended up in Canada, and they haven't, and nobody in their family has been in India for 100 plus years. So I think that's what's so interesting about modern migration, and how museums really have to, I think, engage with that in order to be relevant in this time and day. I'll stop there.
Well, it is actually close to closing. So there are so many wonderful questions, but I really have learned so much from all of you about this really exciting moment to consider and reflect on Chinese Canadian history. Shall I turn it back to the museum now to make the closing?
Thank you for participating and joining us for tonight's program. And a great thank you again to our moderators and to our panelists. As some of you know, both the United States and Canada will be celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month in May. CAM is hosting an entire month in-person events and special virtual programming. Please go to the link in the chat box to view our upcoming events for April and May. We'll make sure to also include this information in tomorrow's survey email. Sarah, would you like to help us close out tonight?
Sure. I'd like to echo Michael's thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and a special thank you again to the Chinese American Museum team for your wonderful work on this panel tonight. For those of you who are tuning in and joining us for the first time, but based in Vancouver and Victoria, we do invite you to attend our exhibitions. And even if you live outside of the cities, we welcome you to visit perhaps during the summertime as things open up. But we currently have the exhibitions at our temporary site at the Hon Sing building in Vancouver, Chinatown. 2 new exhibits that are opening next month include A Tale of Two Families by the Royal BC Museum, and Seeds to Success, Story of the HY Family, produced by the Chinese Canadian Museum. And in Victoria, Fantan Alley, we have 2 exhibits on display as well, one being First Steps and the other Gold Mountain Dream. And we welcome you to also follow our channels and share any feedback or ideas you have through online engagement as well.
Great. Thank you so much, and have a great night, everyone.